Hi, Jennifer Warren here, and I have with me today Jonathan Grammer of Grammer Land and Exploration, and also the CEO of U.S. Carbon Capture. Thank you for being with me, and appreciate your time.
My pleasure, as always.
Yeah. And today we're going to talk about basically some of the trends in Texas to do with the growth of the economy in Texas and also how it's impacting energy. And specifically, there's been a lot of growth in the Texas Triangle area, and we'll get to that. But first, I just want to start with just a little understanding of just a quick overview of what you do as a landman.
Sure. And that both with me specifically and then generally in the land profession, that can change and oftentimes does based on trends in the economy or just trends in energy in general. Uh, the the foundational description of what a landman does, people that hired me when I was in the early stages of my career, the people that I hire now, is to identify the legal ownership of natural resources. And one could say who owns the land, but in this day and age, we want to know who owns the mineral rights, the water rights, the surface rights, which carry with it wind and solar rights. And those that data is contained in county courthouses. And so the landman historically was to go out, identify who owns the property based on their own legal research, and then approach those individuals about obtaining leases. And within that stratum of things, there's a host of other trade skills that need to be acquired. But generally speaking, that's what a landman does.
Hmm. Well, from the landman point of view, how would you characterize the growth of Texas, even relative to other states?
Well, one, just given its size, uh, Texas, it's very difficult sometimes to compare to other states because one, it's so big, and two, we have so many different opportunities that for landmen to get engaged in, and that's been increasing rapidly over the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years, uh, which was about 5 years into my career. I've been doing this about 20 years now since I quit practicing law full time. I don't know that a lot of other states have so many different components that require a landman. We have pipelines, we have electrical transmission lines. You're seeing carbon storage has gotten an enormous amount of attention, and I know a great deal of landmen that are occupied along the Gulf Coast, South Texas, leasing up pore space for carbon storage, solar, wind, and we lead the United States in the production of just about every energy source you can imagine. It seemed to be geothermal. Water rights have become a commodity, mineral rights and royalties. So I would say relative to other states, maybe a tenth of the United States combined in terms of land services and their needs would equate to what Texas alone has to offer.
Wow.
And obviously, as the population has grown in the last few years and the need for expanded infrastructure comes along with it, those opportunities just seem to be increasing.
Yeah. Would you say that, I mean, of the areas where you've seen the most growth, which ones have been most apparent in the last decade? I know the Texas Triangle has
Right.
witnessed a lot of growth. I mean, is that really the fastest growing area relative to others? Can you just provide a little color on that from your perspective?
Relative to others, yes. If we're still talking about in the land profession, I can say that the landmen that I have come in contact with, including some that work for us that have gone to that region, has been for solar.
Mhm.
And to, whether that, so in terms of where the land business is expanding in the Golden Triangle, I don't know of a whole lot of oil and gas activity in that area. It certainly is the most rapidly growing in terms of residential and commercial industrial. And there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. One, it's flat, it's close and east of the I-35 corridor. It's got a lot of existing transmission, and the real estate is still relatively affordable. The closer you get to the larger metropolitan areas, you're looking at some pretty high prices, but there's still large flat tracts that are available in that Golden Triangle area, which to me means I-35, I-45, and maybe I-10 on the southern border between Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio, Houston, and San Antonio.
Right. So what, from your point of view, I mean, and I know you kind of talked about it in terms of residential, commercial, industrial. From your point of view, what are some of the key drivers in this growth? I mean, why is it happening? Why is it happening there?
The test case that I like to use is Lockhart. I started looking at Lockhart this is in Caldwell County, maybe 45 minutes southeast of Austin. It's got the tollway. It's got existing transmission infrastructure, which for some reason transmission remains a very unilluminated and unpopular topic, maybe because it's just boring. People take it for granted because it's poles and wires, and I think a large part of the general population can't distinguish between distribution and different kilovoltages of transmission, but it's incredibly important when it's already existing. It can be detrimental when it's not, which is the problem we have in West Texas, but that's
Right.
a different topic. But that region seems to have a lot of the infrastructure already in place. Major highways and roadways and entrances and exits for large scale development. And it's previously been classified as farmland only. It's flat. It's got good blackland prairie soil. If you want to move dirt around, there's not a lot of rocks, simply put, like there is in kind of the hill country region. And it's close to the existing infrastructure along I-35. And so if you're planning for something that's going to ultimately need to continue to expand, much in the way Dallas and Fort Worth area just continues to move out and out, out like a great big checkerboard. It's very easy to lay things out in squares. It doesn't have the containment that going west of I-35 does. There's no Highland Lakes. There's no changing topography. If you really want to roll out a bulldozer and build something that's big and has a very large footprint, this is a very good place to do. And I think that's why you're seeing a great deal of global attention from Samsung to Tesla to a lot of other large industrial scale companies come to this area, because you can get a lot of real estate and you can continue to expand as needed. And ultimately, you can build the communities that you're going to need for your employees around.
Right.
And that's something to think about. It's really important.
Yeah, because you've got Austin there, San Antonio, Houston. There's all this access. There's universities. There's skill, skills. There's innovation.
Well, and it's another city that has stayed on our radar for the last 2 or 3 years is places like LaGrange and Giddings, which you think about them on a highway scale as far as travel time. Now you can get into Houston and Austin in an hour and a half, which that's almost the same length as a commute in heavy traffic. And with remote working, some of these East Texas communities that are small are becoming more and more attractive for next generation residential development. Right. And that's why this area's got so much attention on it.
Yeah. Plus, it has better water resources than some other parts of the state.
Yeah.
So just how would you say perspectives are maybe changing, like even in the last year? Because I know we've talked about with this IRA legislation, there's, the decarbonization drive, but also we have interest rates rising, and that's finally starting to trickle through. And so what I'm wondering, just from your point of view with transactions and interest, Are you observing any shift in that? Because I know we've discussed that there's some headwinds, I mean, what's your color on that sort of in the current environment and then maybe going forward a little bit?
Um, a recent conversation that I had with an executive for an oil company, and he used the phrase emissions management as a component amongst many in energy development going forward, and kind of had surrendered decarbonization as maybe too big of a bite of the apple.
Yeah.
And it was a very healthy and it was a very intelligent conversation, because the trend that I'm starting to see is not that our objectives in the energy transition are unobtainable, but they're not going to move as fast as the narrative that's advancing.
Right.
We're an impatient culture. I won't say that you're starting to see momentum dissipate, but the players that are going to remain and are starting to become a little bit more illuminated are those that really see the path for what it is, which is a very long and very expensive path to sort of incorporating new components and how we make things go.
Mhm.
And decarbonization is one of that. That's a really big word. It's a really big goal, and the vocabulary is starting to become a little bit more digestible.
Yeah.
Emissions management as a component of your energy production, that's a little bit more realistic rather than net zero by 2030.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Really starting to see people who believe in this, as I do, and a lot of people do, but that perhaps this is going to be in several stages rather than one big swath.
Right. Right.
And that's something that I've experienced in the last 6 months, the last year. Certainly interest rates, anytime the economy is a topic, it's going to trump everything else.
Right.
And, when the economy becomes, and interest rates and finances and new home purchases become a topic, that which was popular last year suddenly is taking the number 2 or the number 3 spot.
Right.
And that's no different with carbon dioxide management.
Right. Yeah. So in other words, it's like a little bit of a different world than say a year and a half ago or even a year ago. I mean, it's just the reality of
Yeah,
where
well,
and
it felt like the floor of the stock exchange, where everybody's holding up their magic sauce and just blurting it out.
yeah.
Hydrogen to geothermal to desalinization to carbon management, carbon capture, carbon storage, solar, wind, almost a mass hysteria, certainly when the IRA came.
Right.
So yeah, you're seeing a little bit more of a methodical cadence to discussions that's, I think, healthy. It's been a welcome pivot for me,
Yeah.
as you're starting to see a little bit more intelligent plans laid on how we go about accomplishing the lofty goals that we set in 22.
Right. Right. Um, so the growth that we're talking about, I mean, there's still these projections that there's a lot of growth in this Texas Triangle area. However, I was just looking at some of the Dallas Fed Texas economy information, and it looks like we're starting to see a little bit of a slowdown in employment, not as much slowdown of job growth even. So that's starting to filter through a little bit. And in our discussions, I just wonder, with the growth that we still anticipate with all the manufacturing that's come to the region, what it's going to mean for energy and energy production. And I know you kind of answered that with what you said. Just any other refinements to do specifically with the growth, this manufacturing that's moving, this industry that's moving, and and energy, like because of where we're at in Texas.
Right.
How would you?
The only missing, I guess, the refinement that I wanted to that I would add if asked, and as you did, is let's not leave out that um, with all this new growth and all the population explosion in Texas, that grid resiliency is still of optimum concern. Um, is we're creating new and in interesting ways and perhaps environmentally conscious ways to create power. We still have this grid, and in the grid, I include even natural gas pipelines and to some extent our roadways, because that's how service vehicles get out.
Sure.
Um, we really need to be focused on catching up as quickly as we can in terms of the ability of the grid to match the demand. Last summer was a little bit concerning for me. I know it was a lot of people as we broke the mega wattage draw. Set a record, I think, in the third week of June, and then broke it 4 or 5 times in the next 5 weeks.
Right.
As the temperatures seem to have made an uptick, and I think it's going to be relatively permanent. I think summers are just going to be hotter, and there's a host of different reasons why people think that is. But it is a fact. We're having more triple-digit days in the summertime. I think we're going to continue to.
Right.
Is how do we reinforce this grid and prevent a summer version of Uri?
Yeah.
And in the meantime, as we're talking about new ways to create power that accomplish these different goals, like carbon-free power, we really need to be focused on dispatchability and realize that dispatchability is going to have to be accomplished with a very aged infrastructure.
Yeah.
And it's going to involve everybody, even the consumers of power, of more responsible use and timely use, rolling brownouts and things of that nature. If you've got a solution, we really need to maintain the integrity of the grid while we're making all these additional improvements.
Right.
And that's something that I don't know that it's talked about nearly enough. I think people have a false sense of security that Uri was just a blip on the radar. I really hope that that's the case. I don't necessarily think that it is, though.
No, I concur with you, and I was definitely, holding my breath all summer. And I know that I can't remember if it was like September 6th where we finally got those caution warnings of, don't charge your EV, don't do laundry, don't, all
Right.
that. And we were close. I mean, we were really close to blackout conditions, and that's real, right? And that's the
Yeah.
group that we live with. And I know, sort of back into the frenzy you're talking about, the refrain of decarbonization and everything. Yeah, the grid is the limiting factor. And so people are like, well, now we have off-grid solutions, and we do, but you still have to have this. We have this centralized system called the grid, and it has to work because it is where scale is, because off-grid solutions are just micro solutions, and at best presently, or they
Mhm.
serve just an industrial user or and a subset around them, but off-grid solutions are not like, they're like one-off, they're more custom, it seems. I mean, do you have any thoughts relative to that?
No, I think you articulated it well. I would never use off-grid um, energy sourcing as a solution to your point. Those are, for lack of a better word, those are just one-offs that are going to affect and benefit a very minute contingent of the population. That's not going to be. I would never want someone to propound that as a solution that's going to alleviate this.
Right, right.
One of the things that people don't think about is that one of the big concerns over the grid is that the power draw and power generation is not static.
Mhm.
There are these massive peak periods of time, and one of the solutions that could be, I think, where the answer may lie in the meantime, is much like an HOV lane on a highway. You
Yeah,
got you've redirected use to spread it more proportionately across the entire grid throughout a 24-hour day.
right.
Is if you ever looked at the demand draw, you have
Yes,
between 7:30 and 9 and 5 and 7. It's just like, I forget the exact percentage. 70, 80%, 60% of the power demand
right,
comes at those times, as you
right,
know. It's
right.
really concerning when you see the plot on the line.
Yeah, no, it's like grid management is like the holy grail of energy, right? In some respects, and we talk about all the decarbonization and emissions reductions, and that's huge. But yeah, at the end of the day, the reality is you want to plug in your phone, you want to charge your iPhone, you want to do your laundry, and
Yeah.
you don't want to compete. I mean, the demands for the grid with EVs, as we know, is a whole nother story for another day. And we see some of that EV penetration, peaking a little bit. Also.
The final feather I want to put in the hat band before we leave it is that all these really interesting ideas, decarbonization, hydrogen production, geothermal, solar, wind, natural gas, coal-fired power generation, everything is secondary. I know a lot of the individual contingent, lobbying groups may not appreciate that, but it is in fact true. Is this is all secondary to reliable dispatchability.
Right.
Period. Once we accomplish that goal and provided everybody's source contributes to that, then we can start talking about, well, how do we limit or restrict or eliminate the emissions? How do we make it renewable? How do we burn it safely? Those all come secondary to first making sure that it's there and it's ready to go and that there's enough of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah. First things first, and taking care of people first
Sure.
affordably is, a priority for sure. I'm with you on that. So, just kind of a last question, just from your point of view and what you've been seeing over the last decade, 5 years out,
Sure.
and more today, of all the stakeholder groups now, which voice do you think is sort of the predominant voice on, the growth and the energy that has to mirror that growth? I mean, what's your color sort of on that sort of big picture idea, and who's influencing, and is it the right voice? Are the right voices now being heard?
Well, that's a great question. My personal observation, and I start every answer subconsciously from the standpoint of fossil fuels. I really try to be agnostic in who I advocate for. If it works, it works. But so much of my career, the people I work around, um, where I place my ballot is in the conservative oil and gas industry, and I have for most of my 20-year career believed that their voice is not loud enough.
Mm-hmm.
I think they say too little.
Mm-hmm.
That's if that's a criticism, then so be it. But I think there's really valuable information that and really valuable and interesting pieces of the energy transition that the oil and gas industry could be a part of. And so I think that the megaphone needs to be dialed up.
Mm-hmm.
To that same extent, I think the voice of maybe the renewable energy transition needs to be dialed down.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
don't know if that answers your question effectively, but I do think there's been an imbalance that's resulted in quite an unrealistic discussion. Is some participants are being too quiet, and it's all unfortunately driven politically. Is there's a lot of intelligent things that are being said that are possible that are not realistic right now.
Right.
And hands down, there's a lot of really important, necessary things from the fossil fuel industry that are not being illuminated correctly. And so the stakeholders, the policymakers, I guess I should say, really can't make healthy decisions because there's just an imbalance in the data that's being shared. I don't know how to solve that.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you're saying.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And
Because the data and knowing the numbers isn't necessarily a good story. Depending on what you are pitching, so no, I agree. So basically I think what you're saying is, yeah, there needs to be a healthier balance in
yeah, I really wish there was more of a consortium approach. I really would envision in the trade associations and certainly maybe even some of the regulatory agencies that we had participants from everybody that were equally matched and equally backed and equally eliminated. And that's kind of what I'd hope would unfold. And to some extent, I think there's been slow movement in that direction, but that you had members of the Railroad Commission and the PUC and ERCOT, the natural gas producers and oil and gas producers, and you had representation from all of them that were just giving objectivity. We're not going to solve anything with so much polarization. And that's, unfortunately, we don't have enough time. We do have a larger problem in the country as far as reaching solutions to difficult problems is we live in a time like no other. It's really hard to stay away from the agenda. And that's not a good way to solve a problem. The other thing that's not lacking, but the main stakeholder that still is slow coming, and I had this experience 2 weeks ago, are policymakers. There's some legislative pieces that need to be put in place for the deployment and the expansion of energy that I don't think our policymakers have been educated enough upon the importance of. And I was at a couple of Christmas parties with legislators that I've backed over the last few weeks who were quite candid about bills that were put up in the 88 that they and the committees that they presided over didn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't understand the significance of conflict between surface development of solar and mineral rights. They didn't understand pore space and carbon storage.
Right.
And we told quite clearly that it usually takes 2 or 3 cycles for some of these new ideas that are evidenced in bills to pass. And you're talking about another 2, 3, 4 years. And so obviously now I'm coming out of our carbon capture work there's a great deal of ground to be gained from the legislative component in Texas. And I think probably the solar industry would say the same thing about the conflict between, the accommodation doctrine that exists between who has rights to develop the surface as it relates to the dominant estate of the minerals, which controls the surface as well. I know there's been 2 attempts now to legislate that to a minimal degree of success. And I think that's really the big push is in the 89th and foreseeably the 90th legislative session, getting some statutory law in place that's going to help advance all of the energy sources that we're going to need in the future.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's lot of challenges still on the education front so that people understand really the playing field more clearly, and especially if they have certain types of ambitions that you can't get there unless you do all this work that you're discussing.
Right. And the one and you and I have talked about this, I think there's a lot of merit and value in a very interesting discussion to be had in approaching the state of Texas and the portion of its land that is categorized as working, that it in and of itself is going through a pretty big pivot. That you don't talk about solar, you don't talk about wind, you don't talk about oil and natural gas and geothermal and carbon storage from their own individual industry perspectives, but as revenue generators for a very large portion of the state that is slowly losing its ability to generate revenue. And that creates a security problem. If land can't produce enough revenue to justify it, then it's going to be put up for sale.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think this is an important issue that we've got a little bit of headway on. But as I don't mean to wander so much, but there really is relevance in what I'm getting ready to say. So much of Texas in the rural regions is owned by the baby boomers.
Mm-hmm.
And as generation passes, you're not going to quite see the appetite in next gen to take over dryland crop and agriculture. And if you can't bring some other revenue source to it, you are going to see, for the first time since sovereignty, a great deal of rural property owned by interests outside the state of Texas, maybe corporate versus individual. And so I really think the obligation is to try to develop as much of this power generation as we can, regardless of what political party backs it, so
Mm.
that the most amount of Texas is getting revenue to justify the properties that they hold. You don't need 25 and 30,000 acres to run cattle,
Yeah.
but the replacement revenue stream for this land just hasn't been developed yet. And so anything we can do to supplement that, I think that's probably the new relevant conversation that we need to be having.
Right. And that's stuff, yeah, that we've talked about, like with that ranch in the Panhandle I was working on,
Right.
trying to create revenue streams and all that. No, I completely, I completely see what you're talking about. And that's a really good point. Maybe a good point to wrap up, and then we'll talk about some other more technical topics
Sure.
in a moment. Is there any last thoughts in this discussion just about, the idea that also with these big trends of, reshoring and new manufacturing and Texas growth, any final thoughts or advice that you might have in that space?
No, I think we've covered it.
Okay.
Nothing comes to mind.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time and for what you do for the state.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.